Welcome to the IISS Corporate Webinar Series. My name is Virginia Comolli. I'm the Senior Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development here at the IISS. This webinar, The New Powers in Brazil's Politics, Disruption and the Actors Shaping the Presidential Race, will examine Brazil's most unpredictable presidential election since the end of the military regime in the 1980s. In a moment, we will hear from Antonio Sampaio, IISS Research Associate for Conflict, Security and Development. Antonio analyzes security and political developments in Latin America, particularly in Brazil and in Colombia. In recent years, he has focused increasingly on the effect of conflict and organized crime on the security and ability to recover of cities in emerging and developing countries. Antonio will speak for approximately 20 minutes, and following his presentation, we will open up the floor to your questions. The easiest way for you to ask a question is via the chat function. You can do that right now or at any point during the webinar. The questions will come through me, and I will then read them out for Antonio's response. But now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleague Antonio.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you very much. Starting with a bit of context, I think Brazil is not a stranger to political drama. In the slightly more than 30 years of the current democratic period, the military regime ended in the mid-1980s. Two presidents have been impeached, one died, and one former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is also one of the main figures in the current presidential election, was jailed. Only one democratically elected president transferred his power to another democratically elected president from an opposition party. That was the transition between Fernando Henrique Cardoso of the center-right PSDB to President Lula in early 2003. Notice that none of the previous or current political dramas have involved the military, at least not in important roles. The political crises of the past 30 years have originated in the core of the political system itself due to systemic corruption that has corroded trust in the institutions of government and paved the way for conflicts with other institutions, such as the courts. But this time, the main fragilities of the Brazilian political system have been exposed like never before. The success of one branch of Brazilian public institutions, the justice system, in exposing misconduct by politicians, has also laid bare the inability of Congress and the executive power to overcome this corrupt system of functioning. In other words, the corruption scandals revealed by Operation Car Wash in the past 4.5 years have decimated confidence in the political system and its ability to reform and modernize itself. I'll go back to Operation Car Wash later because it's a key and quite complicated concept. When placed in the context of Brazil's political instability during the 30 years of the current democratic period, a clear picture emerges in Brazil of a weak institutional framework to manage political power, and I would say even political transition especially. Specifically, I will highlight here the transactional and corruption-prone functioning of the political institutions, the judicial process that has caused its current crisis, and the fallout from that in this year's presidential election. The leading candidate for the October presidential election is from the far right. Jair Bolsonaro is a former army captain that served for years as a little-known federal lawmaker until recently. His ultra-conservative messages are unprecedented in a leading candidate for the presidency. But now they are seen by many Brazilians as a refreshing, if unusual and even radical, remedy against not only the left, but also against traditional politicians and rising criminal violence. As a result, trust in the main political institutions of the country have reached rock bottom. According to a poll by Datafolha last year, the presidency and Congress are tied in the list of institutions most or least trusted by the Brazilians, with only 3% of Brazilians claiming to trust them. They only lose to political parties, which have only 2% of Brazilians trusting them. In contrast, the armed forces are now the #1 institution with 40% of Brazilians trusting them. Recently, Brazil has seen protests publicly calling for a military intervention, although this line of thinking remains restricted to a radical minority. The thirst for political change among Brazilians is certainly understandable. I'll give you one stark number. 1 in every 3 members of the lower chamber of Congress is under investigation for a crime. This means that 178 lawmakers are either facing investigation prior to a criminal charge or have already been charged. And all lawmakers benefit from a privileged situation in which they cannot be charged or judged while they are serving as federal lawmakers. Crime also seems to ignore political ideologies. The Workers' Party, the PT, which is obviously on the left, and the Social Democrats, the PSDB, center-right party, fierce political adversaries are among those with the highest number of politicians under investigation. Car wash is probably one of the most well-known and perhaps bizarre names in Brazilian politics. It's the largest anti-corruption investigation ever conducted in Brazil and probably one of the largest in the world, both in the amount of money involved and the caliber of the politicians being investigated. It started in March 2014 through the Public Prosecutor's Office and the Federal Police in the southern city of Curitiba. Over 4 years later, 134 politicians and business people have been found guilty in crimes related to corruption, bribery, and money laundering, involving government contracts or dealings with companies in several sectors, including the oil giant Petrobras and construction giants such as Odebrecht. The authorities are actively trying to recover $3.6 billion of public money lost to those corruption schemes, most of it in the form of bribery from companies to parties or politicians. $700 million have already been recovered by the investigators and returned to the Central Treasury. This financial damage would have been bad enough, but the most long-term damage was dealt to the trust in the political system, I would argue, due to the systemic and widespread character of the corruption scheme. It involved 14 parties in the National Congress, and at the same time that it led to the imprisonment of one of the most popular political figures in Brazilian history, Lula, it also led to charges against high-profile names of the main opposition to the Workers' Party, Lula's party, the PSDB. Aécio Neves, who narrowly lost the last presidential election to Lula's candidate, Dilma Rousseff, was also involved in a related corruption scandal. The form in which some of these scandals became public also matters. For instance, in May last year, Globo TV, the main media organization in Brazil, released an audio recording made by a businessman of his conversation with President Michel Temer, in which they discussed bribery to the head of the lower chamber of Congress. The previous year, the judge responsible for many of the car wash cases, Sérgio Moro, publicly released a number of audio recordings of conversations between several suspects in the scandals, including Lula and then President Dilma Rousseff, when she was under suspicion of trying to protect her political godfather. And then, of course, the highest political drama of all took place that same year, 2016, when Rousseff was impeached, not due to corruption. It was linked actually to accusations of creative accounting in the budget to hide or minimize a deficit. But the process was greatly influenced by the popular anger against the political class. And the PT, while not the only culprit, had been in power for 13 years by that time, and Rousseff was also presiding over a serious economic recession. So it has been, as you can see or hear, quite a turbulent few years. It has also contributed to a turbulent road to this year's election. With Brazil lacking a tradition of strong parties associated to ideas or ideologies, the political system and the elections have always been dominated by personal charisma. An example is Lula, who has been the engine behind the rise of the Workers' Party, the PT. But Brazil has around a whopping 35 parties represented in Congress, many of which are amorphous amalgamations of local power brokers that operate in patronage systems handing out jobs in the state machinery in exchange for votes or support. And evidence of that is the remarkable mobility of politicians who transition from party to party according to give and take negotiations. The three leading candidates in the polls for the October presidential election have changed parties 15 times during their careers. Bolsonaro, who now stands for the far right, has been through 6 parties. Ciro Gomes, who is now firmly on the left, was once part of the main center-right party, the PSDB, as well as being a member of 6 other parties. Marina Silva, who markets herself now as a centrist candidate from outside the status quo, has been in the National Congress since 1994 and was a founding member of the PT. So in the absence of a strong ideas-oriented political system and the parties to support it, a handful of politicians became the pillars of a deeply corrupt and transactional political system. When the weak foundations of this construct were laid bare and the power brokers went into retreat, the political system now finds itself in its most severe crisis. With little over 2 months to go before the first round of the presidential election, the political chessboard shows an unusual level of fragmentation and the strengthening of candidates with more radical views. To give you an idea of the unprecedented character of this election, consider this. Since 1995, Brazilians have elected as president members of one of 2 parties, the center-right Social Democrats, PSDB, or the leftist Workers' Party, the PT. This year, these 2 parties are nowhere near the top in any of the polls so far. Part of the explanation for this is that the PT has not yet fielded a candidate. It has decided to stick with the narrative that Lula is a political prisoner and that he remains the plan A for the election in October. But the party is widely expected to register a candidate anointed by Lula who remains able to communicate externally from his prison cell in Curitiba. However, an example of how long-standing powers have weakened is the dismal performance of Geraldo Alckmin of the market-friendly and moderate center-right PSDB. Despite being one of the most well-known politicians and a former governor of the country's richest state, São Paulo, Alckmin has been unable to reach even 10% of the votes. In the latest poll by Ibope, he is in 4th place with 6% of votes. The clear winner so far is the category of undecided or those intending to nullify their votes, that is, not to vote in any of the candidates. These options, which arguably show the deepest level of dissatisfaction with the current offerings, adds up to 41%. It's more than what the 3 top candidates combined have garnered in the Ibope poll. An apparently moderate candidate, Marina Silva, who is a former environmental minister and activist, is currently in 2nd place in the polls. However, most analysts think that she will lose momentum due to her very small party and lack of alliances. Ciro Gomes of the PDT party is 3rd and is considered a strong leftist candidate in the Ibope poll. Outside of Brasilia, a number of other challenges have further undermined trust in the effectiveness of the country's leaders and contributed to the current skepticism towards traditional politicians. The issue of criminal violence is not new in Brazil, but it has increased substantially and consistently across many regions, including rich states such as Rio de Janeiro and poorer ones in the Northeast. Violence has also assumed a highly visible and territorial aspect, with gangs being heavily armed and boldly defying the authorities' control of some urban spaces, resulting in gunfights in broad daylight, and not just in Rio de Janeiro, in some other cities as well. According to the latest available data, homicides have increased by 14% from 2006 to 2016. An indication of how intense gang violence has become is the proportion of deaths caused by firearms, which has reached 71% of all deaths, of all homicides. This reinforces the message of Bolsonaro and the far right. He has publicly praised torture as a means to fighting crime and has argued for unrestricted gun possession in Brazil. His long-standing reputation as a hardliner who does not hesitate to voice highly controversial positions is part of Bolsonaro's myth. In the current anti-establishment environment, what used to be a worrying but marginal character of Brazilian politics has now gained center stage. As I said before, this is due to the collapse of trust in the political elite without the institutional support of strong parties or a political system that encourages policy-oriented alliances rather than give-and-take bargaining. To sum up what is a very widespread political crisis, Brazil finds itself in a highly volatile election period. Things can change substantially until October. One of these things that can change is the situation of the Workers' Party. The most common interpretation of Lula's situation, he's currently in jail in Curitiba, is that he is now ineligible to run for public office, even in the unlikely case of a court deciding to allow him to wait for his recent appeal process in freedom. This is because he was considered guilty of passive corruption by two different courts in a case involving a flat allegedly given to him by a construction company. This, according to Brazil law, rules him out of public office for a few years. The PT is likely to present another candidate who has a chance of rising quickly through the polls due to Lula's blessing. And this is going to happen in the next few days because the deadline for registering candidates is 15th of August. At the same time, Alckmin has placed all his bets on the old style of Brazilian politics, hoping that this will do the trick like the last few times. A few days ago, he struck a major deal with a bloc of 5 so-called centrist parties who were in the market for a political alliance in recent months. Just to give you an idea of this political bargaining that goes on in Brasilia, the bloc of 5 parties was endowed between Geraldo Alckmin and Ciro Gomes of the left, who are completely opposite sides of the political spectrum. But anyway, they ended up going for Alckmin, and this could give him a chance, among other things, because a larger alliance gives him more time in the TV political advertisement block, and this has traditionally influenced Brazilians a lot. So however, the evidence so far is that this is an atypical electoral period, and that the odds are stacked against Alckmin. New powers and atypical voices such as Bolsonaro and Marina Silva have been leading the charge. As I said, Alckmin is struggling with around 7% of the votes according to polls. Among the many risks that this political crisis poses for Brazil's stability, the most severe ones, I would argue, relate to the urgent policy challenges for macroeconomic stability and security, and I can go over them in the Q&A period. So, just to conclude, as things stand, political stability, unfortunately, does not look likely for Brazil in the short term. The car wash investigation is still ongoing, several politicians still stand accused, and the country is still bitterly divided between those pro and against the PT and Lula. And as I said at the beginning, Brazil is not new to political instability, and its institutions, especially the judiciary and the media, have showed independence and vibrancy when it comes to uncovering corruption. And even though that causes short-term disruption and instability, it is also, I think, a cause for some optimism towards the future. But the disruption of traditional politics may still be felt painfully in Brasilia, but it may also be interpreted as a chance for a much-needed re-evaluation of the political process.
Well, thank you very much, Antonio. We now have some time for discussion. So let me just remind our participants that they're very welcome to send their questions via the chat function. But let me start with a question of my own. So in early January, a new president will take up office. So when they arrive in the office and they look at their in-tray, what do you think will be the most pressing issues for them to focus on?
Yeah, well, a key challenge for the current government and the future one is the macroeconomic stability, specifically the issue of pensions reforms or social security. Brazil is in urgent need of a reform of its pension system, previdência, as they call it in Brazilian Portuguese. Our pension system is overly generous and overly expensive, and this has already caused some downgrades by credit rating companies into junk territory. That happened in 2016 and early 2017 as well. And the main reason for that was the broad government budget deficit, and a huge chunk of that is because of the overly generous pension system that Brazil pays. Security, and the current government, by the way, tried to pass this bill. It's been unsuccessful, and it's unlikely that Michel Temer, the current president, will be able to muster the political support, in part because his current approval rating stands at around 3% or something like that. And he's a lame duck almost from the start, because he's seen as having contributed to Dilma's downfall, even though he was her vice president. Security is another priority for the future president, as I said, and I think the federal government plays a role in that, because there needs to be good strategy and more resources, and I think the resource bit is particularly acute and particularly within the remit of the federal government. So security in Brazil is spread. The state governments have a lot of responsibility over public security and crime, but the federal government will need to work with states and municipal governments, since many of the security powers are devolved to them. And all of these will require tremendous skills in political compromise and negotiation. And at the same time, the new president, to do all of those challenges, both the economic and the security bits, will need to strike agreements with political parties, and the Brazilian public is more watchful than ever for corruption within those negotiations. So it's a tricky line to thread.
Sure, well, it's fascinating. Well, you mentioned this overly generous pension system. What do you think is going to happen if the new administration trying to restructure the system, makes it less generous in order to make some savings? How are people going to react? So, and what impact is that likely to have on the approval ratings of the new administration?
Yeah, I think that will inevitably involve the level of division and political polarization that Brazil faces now. There is a large section of the public, specifically something like 35% of the public, who say they would vote for Lula if he were allowed to run. As I said, I think that's unlikely. However, that shows that there is a significant portion of the population that looks with nostalgia and admiration towards the progress that he made in terms of social development during his term. He significantly expanded the conditional cash transfer programs for poor people that is called Bolsa Familia. And that sector of the audience of the Brazilian electorate is still think that is still deeply suspicious towards the center-right, the sort of market-friendly politicians, the ones that are usually the darlings of the investors and the industrial leaders. So that division, those sectors of the population who radically consider the current center-right government as illegitimate, that will play out very strongly in the case of any pension system reform. The current president has already made some concessions in his plan of pension reform, which is, by the way, unlikely to be passed before he leaves office, but it will inevitably have to include some expansion of the time in which public servants work in government. Right now, and there's a very interesting piece at the New York Times a few months ago about this, you can see in Copacabana Beach lots of white-haired but not too old people jogging in the middle of the day, and it's just part of Brazilian culture. There's extremely generous public sector jobs, and there are people who make it their career to train for these public sector exams, and after that you have a job for life and you retire at 55, something like that. So this clearly it's a unanimous conclusion by most liberal, by liberal economists, that it has to change. And those associated with the PT disagree and think that it has to be more gradual. But even the PT agrees that it's a reform that needs to be made.
Thank you. And looking at something slightly different, I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but recently we have seen a number of unusually politically charged statements made by some senior armed forces personnel, which have resulted in speculations that a military coup could be in the making. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a wild assumption, a wild speculation? And beyond that, can you tell us a bit more about the interplay between the military in Brazil and the democratic system?
Yeah. So yes, this has been a very unusual development. It's a very unusual political process anyway, but this has been particularly dramatic because on the day before the Supreme Court was due to rule on whether or not Lula could wait for his appeal process in jail or in freedom, it ended up choosing to or concluding that Lula had to remain in prison. But the day before that decision, the head of the army, General Eduardo Vilas Boas, sent a remarkably strong tweet saying that he repudiates impunity and saying that the army is attentive to its institutional missions. Now, the military has been largely very clearly outside of politics since the mid-1980s when democracy returned, when the current Republican Democratic period started. And this comment was part of a gradual kind of raising of the profile of the military in politics. So the President Michel Temer made several gestures towards the military. He attended a military defense council in February of 2018. He appointed the first military person, the first member of the armed forces, to the post of defense minister. That happened right after he took office in 2016. That was the first time a member of the armed forces was at the head of the defense ministry since it was created in the 1990s. And also he declared a military intervention or a federal intervention in Rio de Janeiro, of which the military is in charge. So all of those were read by some analysts as being an unusual level of involvement of the military in politics. However, I think this reflects more these crises of confidence in institutions and leaders, current leaders, than a desire or even a capacity of the military to do anything more radical. And I think the main obstacle, the main guarantor of democracy in Brazil has been the strength and the vibrancy of the rest of its institutions, including, civil society, NGOs, but also the judiciary and the media have been tremendously watchful of corruption and misconduct. And the military knows that the broad audience is highly suspicious of any movements against democracy.
Thank you. Some questions from our audience. Antonio, can you please comment on the risk of labor union strikes, labor activism, or just work slowdowns during the campaign cycle and also in the run-up to the inauguration, and especially in support of Lula?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've seen a recent highly disruptive labor strike by truck drivers a few months ago. And I made reference earlier to this because it wasn't linked to specifically a political actor. It was linked more to the labor reform that was passed by Michel Temer. And to the recent increases in fuel prices that were allowed by Temer. However, it shows that these strikes are inevitably linked to the political actors because some of the posters that were shown and the slogans that were shown included calls for a military intervention. So clearly this was not, they were not Lula supporters, they were the opposite. They were more likely Jair Bolsonaro supporters or the far right. That's the narrative of the far right, to have a hard line. However, Michel Temer recently passed a labor reform that gives more freedom, tilts the power a little bit more towards the employers, and that has struck a chord with the powerful unions, of which Lula is highly has been traditionally a part of, and the PT has deep alliances with the labor unions in Brazil. Obviously, it's something that we cannot rule out, but as of now, I don't see on the horizon any looming strikes. However, if we have to wait, the next few days will be crucial, because there is a possibility that the PT will go for the more radical approach and will register Lula as its candidate prior to the 15th of August deadline, in which case it will almost certainly be rejected by the electoral authorities, in which case there is a possibility of a radicalization of the electoral campaign by the PT, and the labor unions are a key ally of the PT. So I would say that the next 15 days or less will be critical to anticipate any action by the unions.
Thank you, Antonio. We have another question for one of our participants. Is the uncertainty of the election and the corruption scandal seized as a deterrent for new or existing foreign investment in Brazil, or do you think that foreign investors see this as just business as usual?
Good question.
Or just a normal situation that they would face in Brazil?
Yeah, I think when I speak to foreigners who know Brazil, especially in the private sector, have been in Brazil for a long time, they often quote something that a Brazilian Brazilian composer said in the past, which is Brazil is not for beginners. And people who have been involved in Brazil for a long time, they are accustomed to cycles of instability and economic crisis. However, there is a sense that this time around is a bit different. And there is, as I said before, the sense that there are two sides to this crisis. One is highly negative, which is instability and the prospect of a right-wing, disruptive, unusual candidate reaching the presidency of the Republic for the first time in our democratic history, through an election, of course. But there is a very positive side, which is the institutional strength that was shown in persecuting corruption. However, even this positive side has some caveats, because if you ask the 30-something% of the population that would vote for Lula, they would tell you that the anti-corruption campaign and slogans and institutions have been a trick, or have been ill-intentioned, because it's been used politically as a weapon against Lula. So there is a sense that this crisis is unprecedented, and there is certainly, I think, a sentiment that the private sector is waiting to see what will happen. Obviously, if I were a businessman, I would not make a decision in the next few months. I would wait. It's worth waiting until October, and I think the whole country is in a waiting time, including for critical policy initiatives such as the pensions reform. The current president is tremendously weak in his standing, and the political campaign can change at any moment. So yes, there is a high level of uncertainty, and the political crisis, as I said before, will most certainly impact the capacity and the willingness of the future government to do the pensions reform, which is a critical, it's nothing short of an urgent kind of bubble and crisis waiting to happen in Brazil, and this has been repeatedly pointed out by many of the candidates and the analysts and experts. So if the left, for instance, Ciro Gomes reaches power, I think we'll see that reform less likely to be on the proportion that most experts believe it should be. And if some of the more centrist candidates reach it, the likelihood of the pensions reform to be passed would be much higher.
Thank you, Antonio. Another question from one of the participants on whether you could comment on the impact, or if there's any actually, of the escalating trade tensions between China and the US, given that, impact on Brazil's campaign, given Brazil's role as a key commodity supplier to both countries, and mainly China.
Yeah. Brazil has been a little bit quiet on that because the U.S. government has agreed to not impose tariffs on some of Brazil's, or to not impose as steep tariffs on some of Brazil's steel exports. Brazil is a large exporter of steel, and the U.S. is also a key partner of Brazil in meat, buyer of Brazilian meat. So Brazil has chosen to have a slightly quieter approach to this. The platform in which Brazil has been more voiceful about the US has been the BRICS summit that recently happened in South Africa, and in which Michel Temer, the president, said that, strongly advocated for a more stable, peaceful resolution of these trade disputes with China, and less protectionism. That was a strong message of the BRICS summit, their ongoing commitment to multilateralism and to the rules-based international order for trade, especially, which was very strong in the BRICS summit. So it's something that Brazil has been able to negotiate quietly, and it doesn't want to raise too much attention to that, because it has been able to reach some agreement with the US in steel, but it's something that if Trump decides to expand its trade policies to other global South partners, it's something that affects Brazil.
Thank you. In the past here, we have done quite a bit of work looking at Brazil's role internationally as a security actor, development actor, perhaps economic actor as well. I'd like to push you a little here and ask you to take out your crystal ball, look into the future. See, let's say that Bolsonaro, the front runner, wins, the far right candidate. How do you think he would like to position Brazil on the international arena?
Well, I think the most immediate consequence would be for relations in South America, because Brazil is surrounded by two countries that are strongly leftist: Bolivia with Evo Morales, and Venezuela with Nicolás Maduro, or at least that's how it stands today. And Jair Bolsonaro has been strongly, fiercely against the far left in Latin America, and this would lead certainly to high possibility of sparks flying in some of the regional exchanges between leaders, which this day and age sometimes take place in Twitter. So Nicolás Maduro and Hugo Chavez in the past have been strong users of Twitter, and tensions can escalate with time. It certainly increases the possibility if Jair Bolsonaro is president. However, he has also been very, let's say, liberal in his adoption of other people's ideas. When, for instance, he has said publicly that he does not understand about the economy, and that he trusts completely, fully, without caveats, on his key economic advisor, and who is a liberal economist, market-friendly, all the usual qualifications that have been traditionally identified with the center-right, and he has been very, very quiet on the foreign policy front. so we can only really speculate what would happen outside of the Venezuela, Bolivia, regional perspective. That is a bit more predictable, as I said. But outside of that, I think there is no reason to suspect that he would, for instance, radically change the posture regarding the United States as a quiet but reliable ally to some extent, and while also maintaining its emerging powers credentials, the BRICS, its embassies in Africa, its embassies in Asia. So I don't see a lot of change in foreign policy with him. Having said that, I should say now that whereas he's currently in first place, there is a chance that he also has a very high rejection rate. So there are a lot of people who say would never vote for him. So things can change very quickly, and I don't want to send a message that he's highly likely to win. I think a lot of things can change until October, including because the TV political advertisement, which traditionally influences Brazilians a lot, has not even started. So we'll see to what extent it remains the key factor in shaping people's options this year with everything that has happened. And we should also point out that 41% of Brazilians have not decided who they are voting for.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very important that we remind ourselves and the audience that so much can still change. Yes, Bolsonaro might be the front runner, but things could change. And talking about candidates, the only female candidate, Marina Silva, she seems to have done pretty well in the polls, but there also seems to be quite a lot of commentators that dismiss her outright. Yeah. Why is that?
Well, Marina Silva, in the past election, basically she was the running mate of Eduardo Campos, who was also a center-left candidate. Brazil has a long and weird history with tragedies affecting its political leaders or political actors. So the first president of the current democratic period, José Sarney, is actually the vice president of Tancredo Neves, who died. He had a disease right before taking over, and he died shortly afterwards. And before that, there were other tragedies. Anyway, Eduardo Campos, his plane crashed and he died during the electoral campaign. And Marina Silva became the candidate, and she rose like a phoenix through the election. She in the polls, she reached something, like second place, and some polls put her in first place. In the end, she was in third place in the first round, didn't even go to the second round. That has kind of traumatized Brazilian analysts, I think, because they feel that they overestimated her chances. She is seen, and the last time I was in Brazil, I was having a conversation with a taxi driver, and he was making fun of Marina Silva because she has a reputation for being too centrist. I don't know if there is such a thing as being too much towards the center, but she has a reputation for not giving her opinion on some critical issues, such as the car wash and the involvement of the PT in corruption, because she was part of the PT. So she has been seen as not wanting to criticize the PT too much, while at the same time voicing support for the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. So she's seen as being a bit unpredictable and undecisive at some points, and that is not a very positive thing for a presidential candidate. However, I do think that she's being underestimated, that she's being underanalyzed in the current process. Whether or not that is due to the fact that she is a woman, I'm not sure. I think she's a strong candidate. Another reason why she's being underestimated is that she's currently in a very small party that was founded by her called Rede, and she has been very, very slow or underplaying the need to make alliances. So as things stand now, she has not made any alliances with other parties. There are speculations that she is trying to do one, including with her former party, the Green Party. However, she is currently seen also as being a bit isolated, and where she has currently in either second or third place in the polls, Brazilian observers, analysts, they don't rate her chances of growing as being very high.
Well, thank you very much, Antonio. I found this conversation very enlightening. There are so many issues that come into play. I'm afraid I now need to bring the discussion to a close. So thank you to Antonio for your presentation. I also would like to thank the audience for their participation and questions. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our website in the upcoming days. So please do look out for that if you'd like to listen to it again, or indeed to pass on the link to your colleagues. Join us again soon for another webinar. Goodbye.